Hello? Great. Welcome. Thank you everyone for being here. I know it's the last session before the gala and we're all ready to go to the fancy dinner, but it's an important topic and we're really excited to be here today. Thank you for having us, Jeju Forum. My name is Michelle Yehili. I'm the Tokyo Seoul Bureau Chief at the Washington Post, and I'm very excited to be here today with such an excellent panel of experts. In this session today, we'll be focusing on North Korea's shifting approach on foreign policy and the advancements of its nuclear and weapons arsenal, and the implications of these developments on the security environment on and around the Korean Peninsula. For the first time in the history of US-North Korea nuclear negotiations, Pyongyang now seems very serious about rejecting any engagement on denuclearization. Since the beginning of the Biden administration, Washington has been making repeated overtures to Pyongyang, but they've all gone unheard and unanswered. Well, heard probably, but unanswered. This year saw another significant policy shift, with Kim declaring South Korea to be an enemy state and formally abandoning the idea of peacefully reunifying the two halves of the Korean Peninsula, making a sharp break from the long-standing principle set by Kim's grandfather and reinforced by his father. In the wake of the Russian war in Ukraine and the intensifying US-China competition, North Korea has joined forces with China and Russia in pushing back against the US-led global order and has repeatedly warned of a so-called new Cold War. At the same time, Kim Jong-un has been rapidly diversifying and testing his weapons according to the 5-year military plan. And last fall, Kim made a rare international trip to Moscow to meet with Russian President Putin and pledged his full support for Putin and his war, and called his relations with Russia his country's new top priority. This is all juxtaposed against a strengthening relationship between the United States, South Korea, and Japan since last spring, and the Allies have been ramping up military drills around the peninsula, which has further pushed North Korea into a defensive posture. And this is also happening against the backdrop of a quickly shifting geopolitical landscape with the ongoing Russian war, the Israel-Gaza conflict, and the upcoming US presidential election, where, based on current polling, Donald Trump has a very strong chance of unseating Joe Biden. So, against all these significant shifts, we're here today to discuss some key questions, including, is the US-South Korea alliance responding effectively to this new security environment? What is working right now and what should be continued? And what needs to change from a policymaking perspective? We have an amazing panel of experts who I will introduce briefly. Many of you probably already know them. I'll introduce them in the order of their seating arrangement here. Jenny Town, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center and Director of Stimson's Korea Program and 38 North. Bonggun Jun, Professor Emeritus at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy and Non-Resident Senior Advisor for Northeast Asia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Jean Lee, Senior Adjunct Fellow at the East-West Center and co-host of the BBC's Lazarus Heist podcast and former AP Pyongyang Bureau Chief. Frank Senior Expert on North Korea at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And Gina Kim, Dean of Language and Diplomacy Division at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. So each speaker will give some remarks up top, and then we'll have a panel discussion and then open it up for questions. And we will begin with Jenny.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Jeju Forum for this invitation and for USIP for organizing this panel. I really wanted to start kind of big picture because I think there is a tendency in Korea policy community to really focus in on North Korea in isolation of the global realities. And to be laser focused in on its nuclear weapons program and the problems it causes for regional and global security. But as such, efforts to address the issue largely focus on how to recalibrate the approach that we've been taking since before North Korea had nuclear weapons, and in order to try and solve this growing security dilemma. But North Korea's nuclear capabilities have increased, its confidence, doctrine, and worldview have also evolved, but it also does not exist in a political vacuum. Geopolitical trends play an important role in shaping the opportunities, incentives, and disincentives for North Korea as well. And so, for instance, in 2017, North Korea's nuclear program actually posed a liability to the country, to Pyongyang, where the continued pursuit and especially the testing brought about greater hardship and economic isolation for the country, even amongst its friendly nations. But conditions have changed, and it is important to understand how these geopolitical trends may be affecting Kim Jong-un's worldview and his view of North Korea's place within this new world order. And in this context, I wanted to just highlight maybe 4 big trends. The first is a general elevation of the role of nuclear weapons in national defenses. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a non-nuclear weapons state, and threats to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine has really made real the possibility of nuclear use again. Something that had become rather unthinkable in the past, over the past several decades. And so with this nuclear taboo lifted, the psychological effect has been for more and more countries to see nuclear weapons as really an answer to their security, to their national security dilemmas, either their own or by proxy, such as here in South Korea, and really core to their national security. So as countries like South Korea work to ensure access to nuclear options in case of contingency, it makes it really difficult to single out and convince one country that has nuclear weapons to disarm without concessions from the others. I think the second one is really that big power competition continues to exacerbate tensions. In an already conflict-prone geopolitical environment, the prospects of conflict over core interests are high, especially without more consistent channels for diplomatic engagement on sensitive matters. And as a continuation of this, my third is really that there's big power nuclear competition going on as well, right? Not only are the prospects of conflict over issues such as Taiwan concerning, but China and the US are deeply engaged in nuclear modernization and expansion campaigns of their own. So China's potential to rise as a nuclear near-peer nation to the United States, or peer, by 2030 has exacerbated relations with the United States. And as the US contemplates how to adjust to a nuclear two-peer problem, or 2.5 if you include North Korea, while working to modernize its own aging triad. So how North Korea fits into that calculus is unclear and a point of growing concern, especially to our allies here in the region. And my final trend that I think is incredibly important right now is that international law and international norms are being violated, especially by the big powers. And the idea that international norms and international law only being invoked or considered relevant for certain countries puts the whole system in crisis. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was an especially blatant violation of international law, as is the way it's conducting the war. Israel has taken that to another level with blatant disregard for human life in its attacks on the occupied territory of Gaza. And the US military support to Israel and its defense of Israel's egregious violations of international law and international humanitarian law are indefensible. So, moreover, the US dismissal of the authority of the ICJ and the political threats to the institutions themselves serves to undermine the global governance system as a whole. And so these are just a handful of the trends that have direct implications for peace and security here on the Korean Peninsula. And the political and economic impact of growing US-China competition have been well documented, as has the arms racing effect it has had here in the region. But the damage that's now being done to the US reputation, especially in recent months, is not ground that will be recovered easily or quickly. Can international law prevail is a big question, even over the big powers. And if not, what reason do states have to do as I say and not as I do? So in that sense, getting back to negotiations with North Korea faces an uphill battle. This is not a matter of dusting off old denuclearization roadmaps to see what might be a good starting point. There are broader issues here to address, including how to end current conflicts to which North Korea is providing lethal military aid and benefiting greatly from, as well as how to restore the nuclear non-proliferation regime as a whole. and deflate the premium states are now placing on nuclear weapons within their own concepts of national security. So renowned nuclear expert Hans Christensen recently retweeted an NNSA post that talked about how May 27th, 1972, Nixon and Brezhnev signed their first nuclear arms control agreement. And he added to that a good reminder that the nuclear arms control agreements didn't come out of nowhere, but emerged when competitors agreed they were needed to manage risks. But a process like this is not initiated by small countries. It will take global leadership, especially from the big powers, to change the narrative about what makes countries more secure in order to create these new diplomatic opportunities in the future. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jenny. Next up, we have Professor Chun.
Yes. I will focus more on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, last year I retired from my active duty at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and in Korea we have a custom practice of publishing a book when we are retiring. And I put the title of my book as the tragedy of the Korean Peninsula politics. I borrowed the similar name from the Mearsheimer's The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. But as I was working in the governmental think tank for the last 30 years, there was a little bit of ups and downs, but overall, I think we failed. We failed a lot. When we started our into-Korean policy 30 years ago, DPRK might have some fissile material that could produce one nuclear weapon or not. But now they have more than 50 nuclear weapons, and it's growing by 5 a year. And also, at the time, we were, very, beneficial or superior position against the DPRK. But now, DPRK and also DPRK is on verge of a collapse. But now, DPRK is somewhat strong and becoming more serious threat to us. No one say now the collapse of DPRK is imminent, but that was 20, 30 years ago. So in that sense, I think we all failed in our North Korea policies. And also when Tim Marshall's bestseller, The Prisoners of Geography, this book had one chapter on Korean Peninsula. And the chapter begins with this question: how do you solve a problem like Korea? His immediate answer was that you don't. You just manage it. But the problem was that we even failed to manage it, not only solving it. So that is then what went wrong? What went wrong? In this region, 30 years ago, there was the end of Cold War, and the U.S. was the only hegemonic power in the region. It could govern the whole region. And China was at the time almost nobody, and the DPRK is on verge of collapses. But this kind of a structure has changed. China rised. There's a serious U.S.-China competition. Also, DPRK survived with the nuclear weapons. Those are the kind of a very qualitative and a substantive change of situation. So now we are encountering new stage. The previous our North Korea policy is not working at all. Our previous North Korea policies during the last 30 years was denuclearization by any means and unification. Conservatives was thinking of unification by collapse of DPRK, and our progressive was thinking of a sunshine policy. By sunshining North Korea, we're going to induce the change of North Korea, and then we will take it over. So whichever the policy goal was the same. But that failed. Denuclearization failed, our North Korea policy failed, and the unification policy failed. So looking at that, I'm thinking we need to come up with a couple new policy review. One is that we need to adjust our North Korea policy goals. During the last 30 years, our North Korea policy goals was denuclearization and unification, either observation or change, reforms. But those age are gone. So I think probably we need to talk about it, but I think we need to focus more on the peaceful coexistence. Peace, of course, in order to have peace, our policy goal foremost should be based on security. And then peaceful coexistence, and probably unification will be a far away goal. And also, denuclearization is very difficult. Still, I think we need to pursue denuclearization. But as we are encountering very high risk, high chance of nuclear use today, so probably nuclear risk reduction should be our another foremost North Korea policy goals. Secondly, we used to have a North Korean denuclearization roadmap that didn't work at all. We thought you have to denuclearize first, then we will do this and that. But are we going to stick to that defunct roadmap, or even if we don't like it, we may have to think of some other way? For example, why don't we just have a peace regime first, and then maybe we give a little time to DPRK to feel secure, and then to pursue denuclearize. Of course, it's not unpopular idea, but I think when looking at the kind of current situation, if it goes in this way, what kind of future are you going to pursue? Are you going to get? So, thinking about some strategic foresight with such a bleak future, I think we may need to think of something innovative. Lastly, I think we need to have some immediate military and political dialogue with the DPRK. It's not about the denuclearization. It's not about something big, but there are too many military collision or conflict risks here. And also, if there is one, there is a very high possibility DPRK, who is very poor in their conventional weapons, they may try to use nuclear weapons. In fact, at the moment, DPRK had a preemptive nuclear doctrine. That's the only country in the world which has such a doctrine among nuclear-armed states. And also, because of that, South Korea also we have preemptive strike military planning, so-called kill chain. So when we saw these two preemptive, strike plan is colliding, we are seeing very dangerous situation. So immediately, I think, putting aside the denuclearization for the time being, I think there should be some immediate military political dialogue with the DPRK. I better stop here.
Thank you. Jean?
Thank you. So, Michelle, you laid out some of the bold policy moves that Pyongyang has made recently, deepening the relationship with Russia, restoring trade with China, rejecting the prospect of reunification with South Korea, and of course, expanding the nuclear arsenal. We've been asked to consider whether these are game changers in terms of North Korea's policymaking. And I do agree that these are game changers that require a shift in policy in all of the regional capitals. But I think that we should keep in mind that these may not, and hopefully are not, irreversible changes in North Korea's foreign policy. And I think we should be ready if openings for diplomacy arise. I So the premise of the panel was to consider the situation created by these policy changes in North Korea and how the US and South Korea should react in response. But from another perspective, I think it might be helpful to consider that North Korea is basing its foreign policy on how best to take advantage of the shifting political currents in the world today. And I'm not going to have any concrete suggestions like Professor John had, but I just want to point out just a little bit of perspective. Kim Jong-un knows that a presidential election is coming up in the United States in November, and like all of us, he's watching to see who will occupy the White House in January. If it looks like it might be Donald Trump, he may think there is no reason to deal with the Biden administration for the rest of the year. And no doubt he feels the same way about the conservative Yoon administration. Meanwhile, he has something that Putin wants for once, ammunition, ballistic missiles, which he can leverage in exchange for fuel, perhaps even specialized technology, and for legitimacy. The Kremlin has said that Putin is planning a visit to Pyongyang. That would be a huge propaganda coup for Kim Jong-un that would help him boost his standing with his people and also enhance his legacy. But I don't think that Kim's ambitions end with Putin and Russia. He will try to get as much as he can from that relationship, as long as it suits his purposes and as long as Putin needs him. But I think that benefit could run its course. Something to keep in mind. China, of course, very different matter. China has been much more consistently generous with Pyongyang in exchange for stability and for access. North Korea has come to rely on that lifeline that China provides. Access, that's one of the few resources and few sources of leverage that North Korea has, and they know how to play that card very well. But I think just this week we're starting to see signs of the strain in that relationship, with Pyongyang bristling at Beijing for taking part in the trilateral summit here in Seoul. And hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more about that and what that says. So I don't want to rule out that Pyongyang's policy could shift again if the political tides change. But what can be done in the meantime? So I know all of you have very excellent policy recommendations on the diplomatic front. And I think we do need to be creative in looking for face-saving openings for North Korea and for that moment when we can jump in to engage Pyongyang. And I think we need to look for areas of common ground with all of North Korea's neighbors, even in the face of this deepening global divide. And that requires creativity, resourcefulness, and open-mindedness. There's been a lot of discussion in our world about the effectiveness and the future of international sanctions. I wanted to make one point because chasing money has been the focus of my research over the past few years. It's the focus of my podcast for the BBC, The Lazarus Heist. So it's been very clear to me, we've been talking a lot about the border closures, the impact of sanctions, but it's been very clear to me for quite some time that Kim Jong-un has been working for years on a strategy on how to get around UN sanctions that focuses on cyber, using cyber theft as a core means for illicit financing, because there are no borders in cyberspace. Kim Jong-un is a millennial. He's recognized early on that cyber theft could be a low-cost, high-yield strategy if you could just arm an elite group of hungry, savvy young men with laptops and an internet connection. And that's what he did. His hackers are clever, they're aggressive, and they're desperate. They work for him, and they work for the state. North Korea knows that the world underestimates its capabilities, but underestimating and overlooking Kim's cyber strategy, I think, is very costly. Cybersecurity firms calculate that North Korean hackers have stolen at least or more than $3 billion in the last few years alone, and I think that's a very conservative estimate. I think every week we get reports about hundreds of millions of more that are believed to have been stolen by North Korea's hackers. That may seem like a small number, but it's a pretty significant amount for a country that has an estimated real GDP of $25 billion, according to the Bank of Korea. And I think a US official said last year that she estimates that about half of the money that goes into the funding for the nuclear program now comes from cyber theft. And it's not just a form of illicit financing. Kim Jong-un sees cyber as a tool in asymmetric warfare, as an and also as an avenue for espionage. So he knows how reliant we all are on technology. I hope none of you are on Wi-Fi right now. We should assume that he's preparing to find ways to disrupt our way of life, especially here in South Korea, which is so connected, as a form of asymmetric warfare. So I will say that I think that in 2022, the presidents of the United States and South Korea did pledge to create a joint cyber working group. We didn't see much action the first year, but in 2023 and 2024, we've seen that group get together more regularly. So better communication and cooperation. But I do think there's still more room for cooperation and collaboration beyond just the United States and South Korea. So that would be my policy recommendation, is to expand this exchange of information. So, and as I lay out in the podcast, The Lazarus Heist, the North Koreans look for countries and institutions that are vulnerable to cyber theft, places where there is little regulation, oversight, or accountability. And so our governments need to work with those smaller, more vulnerable nations to close those loopholes before the North Korean hackers get to them and get that money back into the nuclear program. And so I will just say that I think that North Korea's cyber strategy should be seen not just as a cybersecurity issue for our IT teams. We really need to treat it as a policy shift that took place in Pyongyang years ago and is continuing to accelerate. We're playing catch up. I do think that this is what I would call a game changer. You didn't mention it, but I'm just going to throw it out there. And I think there's no time to waste in taking this shift in Pyongyang into account as we think about how the security situation is evolving in Northeast Asia. Thanks.
Thanks, Jean. Gonna disconnect from the Wi-Fi now, so thank you for that.
Take a second and get off the public Wi-Fi.
Frank.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So I want to first expound upon some of the major shifts in North Korea's foreign policy approach that you described in the introduction. And so the first one is regarding DPRK-US relations. 50 years ago this month, the chairman of the North Korean Supreme People's Assembly, Hwang Jang-yeop, wrote a letter to the US Congress asking for talks to reach a peace agreement. And then for most of the next 50 years, it was typically North Korea that wanted to reach out to the US for these sorts of peace talks, right? And then it was the US that had the leverage, the stature, to say yes or no or apply preconditions for talks, right? Today, the tables have turned. It's the US that is asking for unconditional talks with North Korea, but North Korea, it seems, no longer believes peace is possible with the United States. And it's also refusing to engage in any talks that has denuclearization on the agenda. The second shift is regarding inter-Korean relations. So again, in the early 1970s, the two Koreas reached a joint communique where they agreed on the principle of peaceful unification and cooperation, at least in principle. Of course, over the next 50 years, North Korea violated that principle many times, but that principle at least provided structurally the foundation that allowed for conciliatory efforts between the two Koreas. Today, that foundation no longer exists. North Korea sees South Korea as the principal enemy, as just a separate country rather than related family. And I would also argue that South Korea, in many ways, despite its constitution, has similar feelings about North Korea being separate. I'm talking particularly about the younger generation, but I think that's really the case right now as well. And then lastly, North Korea is focusing on solidifying countries with, solidifying relations with countries that it has favorable ties with and feelings with, particularly Russia and China. And I think, in fact, the support that Russia is providing in terms of things like satellite technology and nutritional energy assistance, the veto support at the UN Security Council, dismantling the UN panel of experts, all these things mean that there is little urgency for North Korea to change its behavior. And I think maybe North Korea has the confidence and latitude now to act in more irresponsible ways. And so this leads to the next question of how is the US-South Korea alliance responding to these shifts? In my opinion, I don't think it's responding in any new way. The alliance is continuing to use a pressure-based approach to try to coerce North Korea back to the table to discuss denuclearization. But this is the same pressure-based approach that the alliance has been using since the failure of the Leap Day Agreement in 2012. I think the only exception to this approach of the last 12 years was in 2018 and 2019 when President Trump and President Moon engaged directly with Kim Jong-un. And I think this pressure-based approach may have been reasonable 12 years ago because we were frustrated with the failure of the Leap Day deal. And to be honest, I don't think we had up until that point tried a very robust pressure-based approach. So I think it was reasonable to try that. But today, we have 12 years of experience and 12 years of empirical evidence about this type of approach. And the past 12 years demonstrate that when the US uses pressure against North Korea and doesn't engage, North Korea tends to behave worse. And just to hammer home this point through graphics, I put up this chart. I hope you can see it. Oh, there you go, okay. This chart from CSIS, they gave me permission. It lists all the North Korean ballistic missile tests from 1984 to 2024. And what I did to the chart is I then used this gray color shading to indicate times in which the US and South Korea alliance adopted a pressure campaign against North Korea. And you'll see that between 2013 and 2018, and then 2022 to 24, you'll notice that pressure coincides with the most active periods of testing in North Korea's missile program. And then conversely, when we engage with North Korea and offer the promise of incentives, North Korea tends to behave better. There's a 2017 study by CSIS that demonstrated this point, showing a strong correlation between periods of US DPRK engagement and lower levels of North Korean provocation. And we can even see this using the same chart from before. There we go. And when we show overlapping periods, and I'm using the color beige now to represent periods of US engagement with North Korea, you'll notice that North Korea's behavior, at least measured in terms of missile tests, is a lot tamer, right? So look, these are just quick informal charts that I put together, and the CSIS study that I referred to earlier only demonstrated correlation and not causation. But the point I'm trying to make here is this, that Washington and Seoul need to do a better job of understanding what factors really reduce North Korea's bad behavior, and then develop a policy accordingly based on this empirical evidence. So let me end with two suggestions based on the evidence I just described. One is, North Korea is a nuclear weapon country, and the US and South Korea need to deal with it as such. And I'm not saying that we need to normalize relations with North Korea or treat it as a responsible nuclear country immediately. And we don't need to give up on the long-term goal of denuclearization, but we can't make denuclearization the immediate precondition or even the main aspect of talks with North Korea. And that leads to the second point, which is instead we need to make peaceful coexistence, and Professor Chun referred to it earlier, we need to make peaceful coexistence and risk reduction the primary drivers of engagement with North Korea. This may sound unrealistic given the current circumstances, but remember, we already peacefully coexisted with North Korea in the past, particularly between 1994 and 2002, and I'll describe that 8-year period. During that period, the US engaged diplomatically with North Korea constantly. There were US military officials working side by side with the Korean People's Army in North Korea to recover the remains of US soldiers from the Korean War. US Congress members and their staff were going to North Korea very regularly. There were thousands of US citizens going to North Korea every year. There were dozens of US NGOs and academics doing trips, humanitarian, scientific missions and exchanges. And similarly, there were dozens of North Korean delegations coming to the US very often for similar exchanges as well. And by the way, during that 8-year period, 1994 to 2002, zero nuclear tests, 1 missile test, and no reprocessing of plutonium. This is the type of coexistence that we should be focusing on with North Korea. Otherwise, I only see 2 other alternatives. One is war, and the other is hostile coexistence with North Korea, which is basically what we have today and which has the potential leading to war. Finally, one last point on deterrence, since deterrence is the dominant pillar of US ROC alliance policy towards North Korea today. And I want to paraphrase the deterrence scholars Alexander George and Richard Smoke. Basically what they said was, deterrence is only meant to buy us time, but with the time that is bought, we have to use that diplomatically to resolve the problems that required deterrence in the first place. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Professor Kim?
Yes, thank you. I thank USIP for this opportunity to share ideas, and I'm very glad that Frank actually mentioned risk reduction, which I would like to talk about. Well, these days we talk North Korea's threats a lot. But when it comes to threat assessment, we consider actually 2 factors, capability and intention. Given North Korea's advancing nuclear capability, we are now saying that North Korea may use nuclear weapons for preemptive purpose rather than for deterrence purposes. Of course, when we consider capability, North Korea's nuclear arsenal is increasing, which raises our concerns about the potential use for diverse applications of these weapons for many purposes. And when it comes to intention, North Korea's new nuclear doctrine also places more emphasis on operational use of tactical nuclear weapons. And in addition to that, expansion of special forces, training and exercises, well, that indicates a potential role for them to be used in nuclear operations. However, ongoing discussions about North Korean nuclear threats sometimes neglect a very complex dynamics between the 2 Koreas and the US, in my opinion. Well, actually, in response to North Korea's increasing nuclear threats, South Korea and the US are developing a wide range of countermeasures, and the allies are enhancing, of course, the visibility of US strategic assets on the Korean Peninsula and strengthening combined exercises and training activities. Well, actually, the complex interplay between the 2 Koreas drives North Korea to perceive increased threats, prompting adjustment in its own military posture. And it also actually deepens regional security dilemma and encourages North Korea to reach out to its neighbors, China and Russia, to form a strategic coalition. Well, so there are questions about how the inter-Korean arms race is influencing strategic stability on the Korean Peninsula then. Well, I think, in my opinion, the current situation actually poses challenge to both arms control stability and crisis stability. Well, when it comes to arms control stability, we talk about limiting proliferation and advancement of weapons that can be used in a crisis. Because 2 Koreas are seeking asymmetric capabilities for strategic purposes, 2 Koreas are not likely to engage in a dialogue to talk about mutual restraint anytime soon. The development of North Korea's hypersonic weapons and cyber capabilities and underwater drones are are the signs of North Korea's seeking of asymmetric capabilities vis-a-vis South Korea. Meanwhile, South Korea's offset strategy has become enhancing other counter measures like more strike capabilities and more modernized missile defense, etc. However, two Koreas share, I think, common concerns, which is the cost of arms race and the devastation if a crisis occurs. And also, we are very much concerned about higher likelihood of miscalculation in a crisis. Crisis stability is all about ensuring sufficient safeguards in place to prevent any unwanted escalation if a crisis occurs. So the goal is to make sure that the parties in confrontation do not have any incentive to engage with preemptive actions. So I don't believe North Korea is self-destructive enough to initiate a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula out of the blue. Well, because of the following reasons. The Korean Peninsula has a very small theater, so it is really impossible to have damage control if a crisis occurs, which leads to very fast escalation of the crisis. And North Korea does not have the capability to engage in a very prolonged war. So South Korea don't want North Korea to be incentivized to use force. So the current strategy that the South Korean government and the US government pursues is rather focused on escalation dominance, which is seeking advantageous positions in every level of escalation. Thereby, we can deter North Korea from doing something that we don't want to happen. However, this strategy is heavily focused on deterrence, but as Frank mentioned earlier, I think risk reduction is also a very important component in our strategic mind because the NCG, Nuclear Consultative Group, also highlighted this component in its recent joint statement. Well, because there are other ways to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula and reduce escalatory pressure in the long run. So I think, the role of China is still very, very important because North Korea may have interest in engaging in a dialogue to talk about crisis management because it wants stability in this region. So perhaps we can start crisis management dialogue at the track 2 level first so that we can make some progress to elevate this dialogue to track 1 official dialogue on less sensitive issues like early warning mechanism in this region. And we can also utilize every regional dialogue as many as possible for security cooperation because there are lots of channels such as ARF and CSCAP to which North Korea is party. So we can share some information and coordinate our messages to be delivered to Pyongyang through this dialogue. In that way, we can actually discuss tension reduction mechanism in regional flashpoints, including South Korea. And lastly, I would like to mention that arms control dialogues is still significant. And previously, we had many dialogues before. And actually, we also faced some challenges. But let me ask ourselves whether these dialogues actually address North Korea's security concerns. So we have to study first North Korea's security concerns so that we can have a very sustainable and practical negotiation with the DPRK. And of course, we have to discuss how to link nuclear component and conventional component together because previously we had separate dialogues. Sometimes the collapse of one dialogue affected the other dialogue. And sometimes that caused some tension between the US and South Korea because South Korea sometimes feel isolated from the nuclear talks. And these days, we can see some dual purpose, dual use of weapon system that can be used not only for conventional purpose, but also for nuclear purposes. So I think it is a better way to address all these issues altogether. And we have to gather some ideas about our future talks on arms control. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for your remarks. And we'll begin sort of like the panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for audience questions afterward. So if anyone has any questions, please keep that in mind. So many of you have mentioned many different points, but I want to start with sort of like the big picture take that we began with when we talk about the game changers on the global stage, global picture, before we get into sort of these specifics. And I want to pick up on a point that Jenny mentioned up top, which was regarding the violation of international norms and laws by the big powers that have really shaken the global governance system, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to the Israel-Gaza conflict right now, especially in light of the latest Rafah offensive. What implications do these major shifts, major global shifts, have on security on the Korean Peninsula? Jenny, you mentioned, the role of Kim Jong-un's worldview and how he may view his place in this global stage now. And what role do these shifts in these major shifts have in shaping the opportunities and challenges for engaging North Korea moving forward? I want to ask Jenny and Bungan and Frank.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think especially right now what's happening in Israel and the U.S. continuation of military support to Israel, regardless of all of the egregious violations of humanitarian law that have been going on, it really weakens the idea of global norms and international law. And I think this is important for North Korea in thinking through, if North Korea sees Russia leading the charge against, creating a world order, an alternative to a US-led world order, right? Undermining a US-led or Western-led world order, this is helping that worldview. The amount of criticism that's coming to the United States now, the double standards of countries, is if the idea that we invoke the ICJ against Putin but not against Netanyahu, all of these things work to undermine U.S. credibility at a time where there is already a movement towards a new Cold War that are solidifying, right? And this idea that we can have the alternative to a U.S. world order, a multipolar world, is gaining ground as a lot of countries are looking at the situation and looking at sort of what they see as hypocrisy and double standards. So again, if you're North Korean, you're looking at how these developments are shaping up, it really creates a much different opportunity for them, and one where they benefit, where they have more support, where they have greater leeway to do things, where just because the U.S. isn't happy, but the U.S. is also violating international law, which also, again, makes it very difficult to impose on other countries that they need to follow the rules that we're not following. And I think there's a lot that needs to be said about, big power. It's the whole Spider-Man, like with great power comes great responsibility. And if the big powers aren't taking that responsibility seriously, then why should other countries? And I think it's very easy now for North Korea to, one, look at the rising momentum for this alternative world order, but also for rejecting the types of international law that don't work in their favor, as big powers have been doing lately. So that is all, yeah, just to say that, you know, if we're talking about risk reduction, if we're talking about diplomatic opportunities, if we're talking about denuclearization, the question is for North Korea, what is the benefit of doing these things to play into what the West wants, what the US wants, what South Korea wants, versus what benefits them the most? And right now they are benefiting from conflict in Ukraine. They're economically benefiting, they're politically benefiting. Russia benefits from greater tensions on the Korean Peninsula by, you know, having divided U.S. attention and keeping the stakes high as well for, you know, South Korea to get further involved in Ukraine. So, you know, does North Korea really see incentives in risk reduction and reducing tensions in the current geopolitical order? And I don't think they necessarily do, and that's obviously a huge problem.
Professor John.
I will just briefly mention again that how this the current global political structure is different from during the last 30 years. You know, when we are pursuing our North Korea policy, certainly it's based on our assessment of the situation and the DPRK's assessment of the situation. And immediately post-Cold War era, there was you know, the communist bloc, the biggest sponsoring kind of a spear or maybe a protecting a spear of North Korea is gone. And in fact, that made the collapse, almost collapse of East Germany. And East Germany lost their sponsoring great power. And then the result was, you know, West Germany took it over. And in Northeast Asia, South Korea, we also thought that, you know, once this communist bloc is gone, and also DPRK is becoming extremely vulnerable politically, economically, diplomatically, we thought that their demise, collapse is imminent within 6 months or a year or two. That's all our basic assumptions of the North Korea policies. DPRK seem to be also have this almost a very similar concern. That's why they were seeking some protection from the China, the Soviet Union is gone, and also their only silver bullet, which make their regime leadership system survive, is making nuclear weapons. So that's why they, at the, you know, such a heavy cost that they pursue nuclear weapons. But nowadays, you know, the China is strong and the DPRK is relatively stable. So I expect all this environment is pretty favorable to North Korea's continued the existence. That's why our previous North Korea policies based on the assumption DPRK might collapse anytime soon. And the DPRK is extremely isolated. No one is helping North Korea. And also DPRK is vulnerable to pressure tactic. That's why, you know, but on their situation, that kind of situation is gone. So now I think we need to really overhaul our North Korea policies. Seeing this kind of situation, it's almost becoming impossible to expect North Korea's collapse and North Korea is kneeling down to the outside pressure. To the contrary, we are concerned about how do we manage the crisis situation on the peninsula. That's why I think we are entering a very new stage in our history of Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia.
Thank you. And Frank, on top of the earlier question, can you also sort of address, you know, in this environment, how to get back to that beige periods like you showed us? I mean, the world is so different from the last beige period on that chart.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's no doubt that U.S., South Korean policy attention, resources, bandwidth are constrained by the current global environment, the crises. It's also true that the degradation of international norms that Jenny talked about, the dysfunction at the UN Security Council means that a multilateral approach to constrain North Korea's behavior is not going to be effective, and if it ever was, right? And so that part is true, but I'd also add that my sense is that even if we had a better environment, even if we didn't have a crisis in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, you would still have a situation where if we don't have a new approach to North Korea, we're not going to change the results from what we've seen in recent years. In terms of how we get back, so the recommendations I'd have is that we need to, one, like I mentioned, focus on the right goals, right? Because we always said that denuclearization is a goal, but what are we really getting at? We're getting at risk reduction. And we think denuclearization is synonymous with risk reduction, and it should be, until it gets to the point where denuclearization seems antithetical to risk reduction because it's obstructing the ability to talk with North Korea, right? So we need to focus on the higher goal of what I think is peaceful coexistence and risk reduction. And then two, there's academic research out there that suggests that we can start a process of reciprocation in peace and engagement if one side starts with unilateral conciliatory gestures. The theory is called graduated reciprocation and tension reduction, and it starts with typically the stronger country, the United States, outlining this sort of approach, providing the unilateral gestures, and then inviting the other side to respond. We saw something like this in the early 90s when the US withdrew tactical weapons unilaterally from South Korea, when the US agreed to high-level talks with North Korea in 1992 for the first time in 38 years. And we also suspended the major US-South Korea team spirit exercises. These are all unilateral gestures. And in response, North Korea agreed to the joint denuclearization agreement with South Korea, the joint reconciliation agreement, as well as they signed the IAEA safeguards agreement that was something they had to do when they signed on to the NPT in 1985. So I think there's precedent in the early 90s. There's also precedent in 2018 during that period of reciprocal gestures. And I think if we can do something like that, that might help. I don't think the Biden administration is willing to do something like that, but I think that's what we need to be shooting for.
Thank you. Jean and Professor Gina Kim, I want to ask you about the evolution of the North Korea-Russian relationship, which has been of particular concern of the U.S. and the allies and its allies. Professor Kim, you mentioned the development of the strategic coalition between the two nations. And Jean, you mentioned that the North Korean ambition doesn't stop at its relations with Russia. And I'm wondering if you can both expand on your points on that. How is the enhanced cooperation between the two complicating security concerns on the Korean Peninsula? And what should and can the U.S. and its allies be doing to counter these developments? Professor Kim, you want to start?
Yes, what I think the current DPRK-Russia solidarity has emerged along with the U.S. efforts to institutionalize various partnership in this region. So as long as the U.S. seeks more cooperation in a sustainable way, their strategic cooperation will continue. Because what we are seeing is typical balance of power behavior, in my opinion. But we have to also think about the fact that alliance formation is quite different from alliance management, because it is different. So what we see is not just the solidarity between the two sides based on identity, but when it comes to ROC, US, Japan cooperation, it's value-based cooperation, sharing lots of things. But when it comes to DPRK and Russia cooperation, we are talking about a very strategic coalition driven by strategic trade-off. So longevity of this relationship, I have some doubts about it. Because there are lots of concerns that either DPRK or Russia should consider. First of all, well, Russia should think about some entrapment concerns. Russia has not been specific about the scope and depth of its relations with the DPRK. Certainly there is some ambiguity. The risk of becoming involved in conflicts caused by the DPRK will be a nightmare. So it can be an obstacle to strengthening relations between the DPRK and Russia, because the relationship in peacetime will be quite different from the cooperation in a crisis. And there's also a question about trust between the two sides, especially from North Korea's point of view. Well, North Korea experienced abandonment and an isolation during the Cold War and after the Cold War, and it will certainly cast some shadow over North Korea's foreign policy. And also, North Korea has to think about a security autonomy dilemma, because there should be some trade-off. And North Korea has historically valued autonomy, so there can be some limits in its reliance on Russia. And also, we have to think about China factor. China has a different stance on this. Certainly, Beijing has remained on the sidelines rather than actively engaging in the DPRK Russia cooperation. So someday China can probably use its influence to discourage North Korea from taking any unwanted actions on the Korean Peninsula. So there are lots of variables to consider, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just going to pick up on that. I wonder if China is perhaps putting some pressure on Pyongyang when it comes to their relationship, Pyongyang's relationship with Moscow. Because just looking at some of the fissures that we're seeing in the North Korea-China relationship, it does make me wonder how uncomfortable Beijing may be with this deepening relationship between Russia and North Korea. And I do think outwardly all these three countries are trying to project that they have these traditional, stable partnerships and friendships. We know that these are very complex relationships. And it's not just that they've been complex for the last 75 years, they've been complex for hundreds of years, if not thousands, although I'm not good at math. Hundreds, let's just say hundreds. And so I think that the fissures that we're seeing this week are a good reminder that these are complex relationships and that any bit of pressure could perhaps break those cracks wide open. Now, because I do think that though China perhaps has said to North Korea that they're willing to turn a bit of a blind eye to some of the testing, it has its own red lines because stability on its border is a priority. So if the relationship between North Korea and Russia is helping to advance the program with specific technology that propels it forward to a degree that makes China uncomfortable, and I'm not privy to those private conversations, but I do wonder if a little bit of the tension we're seeing this week is reflective of some pressure that Beijing is putting on Pyongyang. And so I do look at the fact that we had this testing just hours after the trilateral summit and a pretty pointed statement from North Korea's foreign ministry rebuffing or naming China, which I think was a very unusual step and that we should read as a kind of signal. But to me, it suggests that there's a little bit of room perhaps for, maybe to take a page out of the North Korean playbook and try to drive a wedge, use this as an opportunity to drive a wedge between Beijing and Pyongyang and get China on board on this particular issue, because I do think that they have a shared interest to try to slow the program down and restrain the nuclear program just a bit.
Jen, you wanted to respond?
I think it's important to, kind of step back from, lumping China, Russia, and North Korea together too much. They have some common interests, of course, and especially in looking at the solidifying U.S. presence in East Asia and the alliances, especially U.S., South Korea, Japan, deepening trilateral relationship. But, Russia and China have very different approaches to North Korea right now. The Russians, and they have different approaches to the global community as a whole right now. China still cares about its global reputation, first of all, and it wants to play a role and a leadership role in global governance. And so there's only a certain amount of space in which they have, in which they're willing to push forward, especially on behalf of their friends, right? You don't have open military cooperation between Russia and China for a reason, because China doesn't want to be too linked to these things, even if they are providing aid, right? China still talks about denuclearization as a goal for North Korea, whereas the Russians right now have already sacrificed their global reputation. And so the more pariah status that they have, and at the beginning it was pariah status, but it's sort of freed them up to have greater impunity for the international system, right, and take bolder moves. And I think the veto at the UN Security Council was a perfect example of the difference between the two approaches. Of, both of them advocated for lifting sanctions on North Korea, but when it came to the vote itself, Russia vetoed it, whereas China abstained. And if you're North Korea, you're looking at these two, and Russia is the country that's doing the things that most benefit North Korea, which is why it is the priority right now. And so as long as you have that kind of division, the relationship with China has ebbed and flowed for centuries. At the end of the day, China still also is sympathetic to North Korea's security situation. So, while they still talk about, while the Chinese are still engaged with the North Koreans, they still don't want instability, especially in the form of a regime collapse, for instance, in North Korea. There's only a certain amount that they're willing to do, and because of that, North Korea has looked to other countries and has definitely, gone where they have greatest incentive to do so, and that really limits the influence that China has right now. And I think, again, some of the backlash that you're seeing this week from the China, Japan, Korea trilateral is a symptom of that, of the idea that China still wavers in its political support, whereas, Russia is taking the moves, is more consistent in the kinds of moves that they're taking.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the difference between China and Russia, and we saw that with Xi's trip to Europe as well, as slightly bungled as it was with the different countries he met. But I think that definitely underscored that difference, and then the fact that he went right from Europe to meet with Putin, I think, was sort of that balancing act that China's trying to strike. I want to bring this back to the peninsula and then open it up for questions. I have this question's for Professor John and Frank and Professor Kim, and then we'll open up for questions. What we haven't quite discussed in depth yet is the reunification policy, the North Korea's movements on, or thoughts on reunification, abandonment of it. What are your thoughts on, how the potential implications might be on the security dynamics on the peninsula? What do you see as sort of the short-term or long-term impacts? And maybe we were talking about this right before the session, but maybe you can address the balloon situation as well.
It was extremely surprising statement that DPRK was renouncing unification. We're not gonna pursue unification, because unification has been DPRK's signature South Korea policy. North Korea, ever since Kim Il-sung, they thought that they are, upper hand as long as unification is concerned. So they have a stronger military economy, and there is a lot of their followers in the South. So they pursued very aggressively. So during the Cold War era, South Korea was relatively defensive on unification is concerned. And then there is a post-Cold War era. Kim Jong-il inherited this a strong unification policy from his father. But I really cannot understand it. You know, this is a much weaker economy. In terms of economy, it's only 1/5 of South Korea. Then North Korea is pursuing unification with South Korea. You know, it's a very strange situation. But somehow, that unification tradition or DPRK, their own kind of a national identity was there. So Kim Jong-il pursued a very serious unification policies. Probably one of the reasons that we could come up with is that they may need some economic assistance from the South Korea. And then Kim Jong-un took it over. You know, by that time, there was some slight change of environment. During the time, North Korea, in order to survive, they have economic assistance from the South, security assurance from the United States. But about the Kim Jong-un is taken over about the 2010, 2012. Already, China was rising. So if DPRK want, they could get economic assistance from China and the security assurance from China without much all those strings of coming from South Korea and the U.S. So finally, and DPRK was adjusting their policies. So it was about, I believe, not just this year, about 4 or 5 years ago, DPRK stopped talking about 우리 민족끼리 or together our people or 우리 민족 제일주의, the first of our nation. But all of a sudden it changed its slogan into our state first policy. And during the last few years, they come with such a strange measures. So we, among North Korean watchers here, we thought the DPRK is pursuing probably, just one state, survival strategy. And now they are coming up with that position. So in South Korea, we have a big debate among us. How do we interpret that? One dominant position is one position is that DPRK it reflects DPRK's weakness. I'm going to survive only on my own. And another interpretation is that DPRK is ready to use military means and nuclear weapons against South Korea without hesitation, because this is not the same people. But more or less, people are on the leaning toward the first. It's a DPRK is probably weaker position. Then our position is that how do we use that? The DPRK is one state survival strategy, and in South Korea we also have some debate. Are we going to pursue two-state policy? In fact, about 75% of Korean people are liking two-state policies. But still, some people are seeking some unification and strong unification policies. So still, we have some debates among us. And the current government was choosing to emphasize unification.
Frank?
Yeah, so really quickly, I see North Korea's abandonment of peaceful unification as a very pragmatic approach, especially when you consider that, at least from North Korea's perspective, one, you have, the shifts in South Korean administrations having, going from, engagement to a very hardline position, back and forth again. And then when you consider U.S.-South Korea policies towards unification, if you look at the 2009 joint vision statement, U.S.-South Korea joint vision statement, or the U.S.-South Korea joint statement from last year's summit during the anniversary of the seventh anniversary of the alliance, both of them in both of those statements, the U.S. reaffirms support for unification of the peninsula under a democratic-led, market-oriented government, right? So from our point of view, that sounds reasonable. From North Korea's point of view, that's a regime change policy, right? Because if you have a democratic-led, market-oriented government under unification, that basically means the end of the Kim regime, right? So I think Kim Jong-un is being very realistic based on consistent alliance policies over the decades that unification from a peaceful standpoint is not possible, all right? Let's just admit it. Let's do away with these organizations and bureaus and Uri Minjokgiri and United Front departments. Let's orient it towards what's realistic, right? And maybe it might be appropriate for South Korea to also consider that, given what Professor Jun said, that the younger generation, 75%, also see North Korea as a separate country and don't think unification is appropriate or realistic going forward.
Professor Kim?
Yes, I also share the same view. Actually, we can think of 3 different scenarios. The factors at the domestic level may include North Korea's pursuit of internal unity and keeping the stability for possible power succession in the long run, and it is seeking self-help and internal balancing instead of external balancing. So if that is true, then North Korea is seeking a long-term strategy. So what's going to come next is probably formal change of its constitution, and through this, North Korea can just muddle through economically, but it can expect rally around the flag effect politically. At the bilateral relationship level, probably it is affected by the current government's very assertive policy toward the DPRK, and probably North Korea thinks that there is no point of seeking reconciliation because there is no chance of doing it. Then North Korea is seeking short-term strategy rather than long-term strategy because the politics here in the South may change. And it is also context-driven, and possibly there can be re-engagement afterwards. At the international level, we can consider the topic that we just discussed, the strategic relations with Russia. And probably North Korea is very pleased with the opportunistic bandwagoning for profit. So it is seeking external balancing rather than internal balancing. So in that sense, North Korea is seeking a midterm strategy. I think it is midterm because I told you this relationship will not be sustainable in the long run. Probably until the geopolitical environment changes, then there can be some, for the time being, there can be some increase of trade and exchanges of people with China and Russia, but it is still, midterm goal. So we can, think about different scenarios. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, we have just about 10 minutes left, so I think we'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if anyone has any. Oh, yes, right here.
Well, thank you. My name is Jeju, and I am an undergraduate student studying international relations. And first of all, thank you all for this great session this afternoon. It was a great lecture for me, and I hope all of us think the same. So not in this session, but also in many previous sessions, many speakers pointed out that the policy paradigm is changing from denuclearization of DPRK to deterrence or even so-called risk management. And with this, they pointed out that despite the fact that denuclearization is difficult, we should still think of an option, and also along with the changed paradigm, which is mainly about deterrence and coexistence, we should still think of the denuke in the long term. But I personally believe that whatever the word we use, or this kind of remark, or this kind of rhetoric, means that more or less we are giving up the denuke and moving our goal to deterrence under the changed situation. So then I think the issue here is abbreviated to whether we should pursue denuke or not. And I beg you for the generous reply with this lacking questions. Thank you very much.
Frank?
So the reason I think that denuclearization needs to remain a goal, whether it's like a long-term goal, an aspirational goal, a fig leaf goal, because from the political perspective, to generate any support of political support from the U.S., I'm thinking particularly about Congress, support for any sort of deal with North Korea, denuclearization has to be somewhere in there, right? So, whether we are trying to get appropriations or funding for some sort of engagement with North Korea, whether we're trying to get support from the human rights constituency, denuclearization has to be somewhere in the mix. But again, because it's antithetical to what North Korea is seeking, it can't be a near-term or even medium-term proposition, right? And so how do you thread that needle? How do you keep denuclearization in the mix, but not to a point where North Korea thinks it's obstructing what they want? So I'm not sure. It may be some sort of deal where where North Korea reaffirms its commitment under the Singapore Statement to complete denuclearization, but it's sort of like also the P5 agreement, good faith agreement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to reduce and disarm, because they also on paper made that commitment. And for decades, that hasn't happened, right? So it may be some sort of fig leaf statement like that.
Well, Gina and then Professor John. Okay, Professor.
I just want to quickly add that, in fact, my major area is the North Korean nuclear issue. Now people are saying that the denuclearization is a long gone. It's an impossible project. But looking back, I think we mismanaged very badly our North Korea policy. We mismanaged very badly denuclearization strategy. Our strategy was really badly managed. The government changes, policies changes. It's up to we always we are very good at blaming North Korea, but also we are very we are not good at that and managing our denuclearization policies. So while at this moment it's going to be very difficult, I still think that it should be one of very important policies. If only even now we manage it correctly, using all the incentives that we could use, I think there will be some, not the whole complete denuclearization immediately, but we could make some progress.
Let me make just a quick 3 points. First, I don't want to see interim measures and denuclearization as a zero-sum game. Right? Any steps, including arms control, can be realistically modified in the long run, so without abandoning the goal of denuclearization. Second point, arms control talks can open, or any types of interim measures negotiations can open a space for further talks on denuclearization. Because currently there is a lack of option between CBID, which pursues denuclearization, and a maximum pressure, which is what we are relying on. So there should be some, other measures that we can consider. Third, I think South Korea also has interim measures in its policy, because audacious initiative, 담대한 구상, that's actually includes interim measures, including arms control and security trade-offs. Although details has not been announced yet, because we have to keep that in mind, that it is not strategically beneficial for the South Korean government to open up everything. But still, the government is also working on phased approach toward the denuclearization. So this is not a new idea. Thank you.
One more question. We have one in the middle. Oh. Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Andres Sanchez from the Spanish news agency. I wanted to ask you, given how sanctions for decades already have seemed to not be effective, given that China and Russia are not even implementing them anymore, and definitely are not willing to pass new resolutions on the Security Council. And as Ms. Lee pointed out, given how North Korea's cyber theft program is so overwhelmingly strong at this point, and how we're all trying to catch up with it, and they're raking so much money. So at this point, I wanted to ask you, do you think we're running out of pressure points, of real pressure points with North Korea? Thank you.
Thank you. I had a sanctions question as well, so I'm glad you raised this. Jean and Jenny, do you want to take them? All right, Jenny, you start, and then Jean.
So sanctions play a role. They don't solve the problem. And I think for too long we have sort of leaned on sanctions as a way to solve the problem. And so if we can just find the right mix of sanctions, then North Korea will finally feel enough pressure that they're going to come around and change their mind. Well, empirical studies show that the sanctions are most effective in the threatening phase of them. If you already have economic and political relations and you threaten sanctions, the country should want to continue that relationship in good measure, and so they change behavior or they come to negotiations and you work out something. By the time you've imposed the sanctions, you've already resigned yourself to the fact that they're not going to change. Right, and so what we've seen for North Korea is that sanctions have played a role in imposing costs on North Korea for continuing the decisions that they've made and continuing their WMD development. But no, it has not changed their calculus about wanting nuclear weapons and moving forward with that. So while countries still see political value in imposing sanctions, and at this point it's going to be mostly unilateral and not multilateral, not UN sanctions, they do have a limited practical effect. And they cannot be like the entirety of our policy. If we want to start to affect change with North Korea, we have to better internalize the nature of the challenge that we're facing. And again, can you pressure an insecure country into disarming? Is that really the right strategy? And if you accept the idea that the nature of the problem when we started this was a non-proliferation challenge, right? North Korea did not have nuclear weapons when we negotiated the agreed framework back in 1994. But they have an extensive WMD program now. So, this isn't a non-proliferation challenge, this is a disarmament challenge. And I think, we need to recalibrate, because the way we approach the issues now is the same way that we did back in 1994, even though the nature of the challenge has fundamentally changed. So I think it does take some real recalibration. It's going to take some difficult and uncomfortable decisions and some political leadership to actually change the way we approach North Korea to better address the challenge as it stands today versus where we started this journey.
Jean?
I would just say that whether or not they've been effective, to say that they're completely ineffective is a big statement. It'd be interesting to examine where and when they have been effective. But North Korea has been dealing with sanctions for decades, and they've become very adept at getting around them. So they're always going to be looking at how to get around the sanctions. And of course, sanctions are only effective if they're enforced. And we're starting to see certain countries very willing to flout the sanctions in order to help North Korea. I was just going to say that another way to look at sanctions, of course, is that it is a diplomatic tool and something to keep in mind, and that at the negotiations between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, the last 5 rounds of the UN sanctions were a big part of those negotiations. So while you have North Korea expanding its arsenal, perhaps on the other side, if and when you get to the negotiating table, you need to have something else to negotiate with as an incentive. So it's just another way to look at sanctions and the tool that they can play.
Great. Well, that's about all we have time for. Thank you so much for everyone, to everyone for coming, to all of our esteemed panelists. Thank you for your insights and your analyses. I want to thank Jeju Forum again, and to USIP, very much thank you. And personally, thank you for a very gender-balanced panel selection here. Very refreshing balance, and perhaps, women takeover of the panel. I appreciate it. And I hope to see the rest of you around. Thanks.
Spend my coin for sure. I'm gonna be myself, or I could be some